Let me start with a simple question. What if I told you that Meta's biggest problem right now is not technology, not data, not even competition? What if the real problem is fear? Because in 2025, Meta is not just building artificial intelligence, Meta is running from something. And the faster it runs, the more dangerous the race becomes. In January 2025, Mark Zuckerberg sent a message to Meta employees. He told them to buckle up because the year ahead would be intense. At first, it sounded like the kind of message tech CEOs always send when they want people to work harder. But this time, it wasn't motivation, it was a warning. Because from that moment on, Meta stopped moving like a tech company and started moving like a company that believes it cannot afford to be late again. Over the past year, Meta has reorganized its AI teams again and again. It built a new power center called the Superintelligence Lab. It poured tens of billions of dollars into data centers, chips, and massive computing clusters. It openly entered an arms race with OpenAI and Google. And it placed one single idea above everything else. We cannot be slow. Speed became the strategy. Urgency became the culture. Control became instinct. And that is where the trouble began. People keep saying Meta is investing hundreds of billions into AI, but that money is not buying certainty. It is not buying dominance. What it is really buying is time. Time to catch up. Time to experiment. Time to avoid missing the next platform shift. Because Mark Zuckerberg has already lived through the nightmare of being late, and he refuses to experience it again. Meta dominated the era of social media. It won mobile. It built the most powerful advertising machine in human history. But when generative AI exploded, Meta was not leading the story. ChatGPT was not built by Meta. The narrative was not controlled by Meta. The spotlight was not on Zuckerberg. And for a founder who once defined entire technological eras, being a follower is unbearable. So Meta did not simply decide to compete, it decided to sprint. The problem is that speed is useful in a startup, but dangerous in a giant. When faster becomes more important than right, organizations begin to distort. At Meta, that distortion appeared everywhere. Teams were constantly reorganized, decisions flowed upward, and hesitation became a liability. Zuckerberg's solution was to centralize everything. He dismantled the old AI structure and rebuilt it around a single core, the Meta Superintelligence Lab. On paper, it looked logical. Fewer silos, faster decisions, more focus. In reality, it created confusion, pressure, and fear. When everything flows upward, no one feels safe taking risks. People stop thinking long-term. They stop experimenting. They start waiting for instructions. The first real warning sign came with Llama 4. This model was supposed to be Meta's breakthrough. Internally, expectations were enormous. Externally, hype was everywhere. But inside the company, engineers were already worried. Some quietly admitted that the model might not live up to what leadership was promising. Then the cracks appeared. Deadlines slipped. Testing was rushed. Performance lagged behind competitors. And when Llama 4 finally arrived, the reaction was brutal. Benchmarks disappointed. Critics accused Meta of manipulating rankings. And the flagship version, Llama 4 Behemoth, never truly showed up. Inside Meta, the conclusion was clear. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was an organizational one. Everyone was moving fast, but no one was aligned. Teams blamed data, they blamed timelines, they blamed testing. But underneath all of it was a shared reality. No one truly owned the outcome. When direction changes every few weeks, people stop committing deeply. They execute orders, they avoid responsibility, and innovation slowly suffocates. After the Llama 4 disappointment, Meta changed direction again. 2 new projects emerged inside the company. One was called Mango, focused on image and video generation. The other was Avocado, a new language model designed to excel at advanced code generation. These were not small upgrades. They were a reset, a declaration that Meta was done playing catch-up and ready to leap forward. At least, that was the plan. To lead this reset, Zuckerberg made a bold move. He personally recruited more than 20 researchers from OpenAI. And he brought in a new public face for Meta's AI reboot, a 28-year-old founder named Alexander Wang. Meta paid more than $14 billion to acquire nearly half of Wang's company, Scale AI. The message was clear. Meta was willing to pay anything for momentum. But momentum without trust is unstable. And this is where the story changes. Because this was no longer just about models or benchmarks. It was about power. Control versus creativity. Speed versus depth. Fear versus patience. And at the center of it all stood Mark Zuckerberg himself. Alexander Wang did not join Meta expecting an easy job, but he also did not expect to feel trapped. On paper, his arrival looked like a victory lap. A young founder, a massive valuation, a public signal that Meta was serious about AI. The company paid more than $14 billion to buy nearly half of his startup, Scale AI, and positioned him as a central figure in its AI reboot. From the outside, it looked like empowerment. From the inside, it felt like pressure. Because Wang didn't walk into a clean organization. He walked into a system already under stress. Llama 4 had just disappointed. Teams were reorganized again and again. Deadlines were aggressive. Expectations were unclear. And above all, the CEO was watching everything. Wang came from a very different world. At Scale AI, speed mattered, but ownership mattered more. Small teams, clear accountability, fast iteration. If something failed, you fixed it and moved on. Meta was the opposite. At Meta, nothing truly belonged to one person. Projects overlapped, reporting lines shifted, and decisions that seemed final on Monday could be reversed by Thursday. Very quickly, Wang realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't really being asked to lead. He was being asked to execute someone else's urgency. According to people close to him, his frustration began quietly. He tried to reorganize teams. He tried to clarify priorities. He tried to push for deeper technical focus. But again and again, his efforts ran into the same wall. Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg did not just set direction. He intervened in details. He reviewed projects personally. He questioned timelines. He adjusted priorities midstream. In some cases, he even influenced where teams physically sat. This was not strategic oversight. It was micromanagement at scale. For a young leader trying to build momentum, this kind of environment is suffocating. Every decision feels provisional. Every plan feels temporary. Every success feels fragile. Over time, Wang's disappointment grew. People inside Meta began to notice that he looked exhausted, not energized. Meetings dragged, decisions stalled, projects moved forward but without conviction. And Wang was not alone. The same frustration appeared across Meta's AI organization. Engineers complained privately that they were constantly reacting instead of building. Managers said they spent more time preparing updates than doing real work. Researchers felt pressured to align with short-term narratives instead of long-term breakthroughs. And Wang was not alone. The same frustration appeared across Meta's AI organization. Engineers complained privately that they were constantly reacting instead of building. Managers said they spent more time preparing updates than doing real work. Researchers felt pressured to align with short-term narratives instead of long-term breakthroughs. A dangerous mindset began to spread. Don't be bold. Don't take risks. Don't be the one who makes a mistake. In other words, survival became more important than innovation. This is the moment when organizations quietly lose their edge. Not because people stop working, but because they stop believing that great work will be protected. Inside Meta, this mindset showed up everywhere. Teams optimized for safety. Projects were framed conservatively. Radical ideas were softened before they ever reached leadership. And when a company reaches this stage, even massive investment can't save it. Because innovation doesn't die loudly, it dies politely. Wang believed Meta needed breakthroughs, but Meta needed reassurance. Those two needs were no longer aligned. Things became even more complicated when internal politics entered the picture. Meta has a long memory. Loyalty matters. History matters. Being a Zuck original still carries weight. Wang was neither old guard nor technical legend. He was an outsider, young, highly visible, and attached to an expensive acquisition. That made him vulnerable. Every misstep felt magnified. Every delay felt personal, and every internal disagreement felt political. Some employees began to question whether Wang deserved his position. Others quietly resented his authority, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked roots. And Meta, despite all its talk of disruption, remains deeply hierarchical. One former employee described it bluntly: "If you are one of Zuckerberg's longtime allies, mistakes are forgiven. If you are an external hire, mistakes define you." Wang quickly understood this reality. He wanted to build something meaningful. Instead, he found himself navigating budgets, reporting structures, and shifting priorities. His role became less about innovation and more about managing tension. And then came the deeper problem. Meta's leadership was no longer interested in waiting. Long-term research was becoming a liability. Anything that couldn't produce visible results soon was pushed aside. Resources flowed toward products that could be demoed, benchmarked, and marketed. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Results now. Vision later. For someone like Wang, this created an impossible dilemma. He was hired to help Meta win the future, but judged on how fast he could justify the present. Eventually, the frustration became impossible to hide. According to reports, Wang began privately venting to people he trusted. He described the environment as suffocating. He expressed concern that innovation was being strangled by control. These comments did not come from ego. They came from exhaustion. And when a leader reaches that point, the organization is already in trouble. Because when leadership loses confidence, it spreads faster than any rumor. Meta's AI teams could feel it. The uncertainty, the tension, the sense that no one truly had the authority to say, "This is the path and we are sticking to it." Instead, everything felt temporary. And this instability had consequences far beyond one person. Because while Wang struggled to operate, something even more serious was happening quietly in the background. Meta was beginning to lose its elders. The people who once defined its intellectual direction. The people who were protected from short-term pressure. The people who believed in slow thinking. And one of them was about to leave. While Alexander Wang was struggling to operate inside Meta's tightening structure, something far more serious was unfolding quietly in the background. Meta was losing its elders. Not managers, not product leads, but the people who defined what the company believed in. And among them, one departure mattered more than all the others combined. Yann LeCun. Inside Meta, LeCun was not just another executive. He was a symbol. A Turing Award winner, one of the pioneers of modern deep learning, the intellectual backbone of Meta's AI research culture. For years, his presence sent a clear signal to the world. Meta was a place where long-term thinking was protected, where fundamental research could exist without immediate commercial pressure, where it was acceptable to work on ideas that might take a decade to mature. That culture did not disappear overnight. It eroded, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. As the AI race accelerated, Meta's priorities shifted. Resources began flowing toward projects that could ship quickly. Budgets for long-term exploration were trimmed. Research teams were asked to align more closely with product timelines. None of this was announced loudly. There were no speeches saying, "Long-term research no longer matters." Instead, the message arrived through decisions, through approvals that never came, through projects that were delayed, merged, or quietly shut down. For someone like LeCun, this was deeply unsettling. He had spent years arguing that true artificial intelligence could not be built by simply predicting the next word. He believed that models needed to understand the physical world, causality, and structure. He called this direction world models, and he saw it as a necessary path toward real intelligence. But world models are slow, they are expensive, they do not produce flashy demos on quarterly timelines. In a company now obsessed with speed, that made them inconvenient. As Meta reorganized its AI teams again and again, LeCun watched resources move away from foundational research and toward short-term deliverables. The environment that once protected patients began to disappear. And then came the moment that broke the illusion. According to people familiar with the situation, LeCun was informed that under the new structure, certain research initiatives would require reporting through Alexander Wang's organization. This was not about personal conflict. It was about hierarchy. To LeCun, this signaled something fundamental. Long-term research was no longer independent. It was being placed beneath an execution-focused chain of command. For a scientist whose work defined the field itself, this was unacceptable. Not because Wang lacked talent or intelligence, but because research must be insulated from short-term pressure to survive. Once it becomes subordinate to speed, it stops being research. At that moment, LeCun understood something painful. Meta was no longer a place where slow thinking was protected. And when that realization sinks in, there is nothing left to argue about. So he chose to leave. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public accusations, just a quiet exit that spoke louder than any press release. Inside Meta, the impact was immediate. People noticed. When someone like Yann LeCun leaves, it sends a message that cannot be ignored. It tells every researcher, every engineer, every leader that the ground has shifted. If even he cannot protect long-term thinking, who can? Soon after, more departures followed. Senior research leaders, long-serving executives, people who had spent years building Meta's internal culture. At the same time, newer hires struggled to stay. Some left within months. Others disengaged quietly, waiting for opportunities elsewhere. Meta found itself in a dangerous position. Old guards were leaving because they no longer recognized the company. New leaders were struggling because they lacked space to operate. And the remaining teams were caught in between, executing without conviction. This is how organizations lose their soul. Not through scandal, not through collapse, but through exhaustion. Everyone is busy. Everyone is under pressure. But no one is thinking freely. And all of this was happening while Meta was spending more money than ever before. Which raises a terrifying question. What happens when a company burns hundreds of billions of dollars, but loses the people who know how to turn time into insight? Because at this stage, Meta still had money. It still had infrastructure. It still had reach. What it was losing was something far more fragile: direction. And once direction is gone, speed only makes the crash faster. While Meta was losing its intellectual anchors, it was doing something else at the same time. It was spending money at a scale few companies in history have ever attempted. This is where the story stops being about culture and starts being about gravity. Because once numbers reach a certain size, they stop being flexible. They start controlling behavior. For years, Meta had one advantage that softened every mistake: cash flow. Advertising money arrived like clockwork. Even when the company bet wrong on the metaverse, it could afford to wait. But AI changed the math. In 2025 alone, Meta's capital expenditures were projected to reach at least $70 billion. That was almost double the year before. And this was not experimental spending. This was infrastructure spending. Data centers, custom AI chips, supercomputing clusters. These are not investments you can quietly reverse. Once you build them, you must use them. Once you finance them, you must justify them. And Meta knew it. So did investors. To support this expansion, Meta did something unusual for a company that once relied mostly on internal cash. It turned aggressively to debt. In late 2025, Meta issued around $30 billion in corporate bonds, one of the largest corporate debt offerings in U.S. history. This was not a symbolic move, it was a commitment. Because when a tech company starts funding its future with debt, it is no longer just betting on innovation. It is betting on continuity, on stability, on confidence. Debt demands a story, and that story has to keep getting bigger. This is where Zuckerberg's mindset becomes critical. In public, he tried to reframe the situation. He said that even if Meta spent an extra $200 billion, it would be unfortunate but acceptable. What would be truly dangerous, he argued, was moving too slowly. At first glance, this sounded bold, visionary, almost heroic. But psychologically, it revealed something else. It showed that slowing down was no longer an option. Meta had crossed a threshold where hesitation itself became riskier than excess. Once that happens, every decision becomes reactive. You don't ask, is this the right move? You ask, what happens if we don't do this now? And when that question dominates, mistakes multiply. The biggest unresolved issue was also the most basic one. How does AI make money for Meta? Despite all the spending, the answer remained vague. Would AI enhance advertising? Possibly. Would it drive subscriptions? Maybe. Would it become a platform? Unclear. Internally, there was no unified narrative. Some teams believed AI should remain open source to drive ecosystem dominance. Others pushed for proprietary models. Some argued for AI companions and social interaction. Others wanted enterprise tools. Each idea had merit. None had clarity. And without clarity, pressure grows. Advertising teams began to feel it. Meta is, at its core, an advertising company. AI spending without a visible path to monetization makes ad leaders nervous. They don't oppose innovation, but they need timelines. Investors felt it too. Massive infrastructure spending, followed by uncertain returns, forces uncomfortable questions. How long can this last? What happens if growth slows? What happens if AI leadership doesn't materialize? Meta found itself in a paradox. It needed time for AI to mature, but its financial commitments demanded results. That tension fed back into leadership behavior. More oversight, more reviews, more urgency, and less patience. The company began to resemble a runner who had sprinted so long that stopping felt impossible, even as exhaustion set in. This is how momentum turns into inertia. The scary part is that none of this feels like failure in the moment. Servers are being built, models are improving, products are shipping. From the outside, everything looks active. But activity is not direction. And speed without direction creates noise, not progress. By this point, Meta was no longer just chasing competitors. It was chasing its own balance sheet. Every additional dollar spent increased the psychological cost of slowing down. Every new data center locked the company further into its current trajectory. The runway was shrinking, not because cash was gone, but because expectations were rising. And this is when risk quietly shifts. The greatest danger was no longer losing to OpenAI or Google, it was losing the ability to change course. Because once an organization becomes financially and emotionally committed to a single narrative, adaptability disappears. Meta was still moving fast, but it was no longer moving freely. As Meta pushed harder on AI, another storm was quietly forming. This one had nothing to do with models, chips, or data centers. It had to do with trust. In mid-2025, internal policy documents surfaced that immediately alarmed researchers, regulators, and ethicists. The documents outlined how Meta's AI chat systems were allowed to interact with users, including minors. At first glance, the language looked technical, procedural. But the implications were serious. The policies allowed AI chatbots to engage in emotionally intimate conversations with young users. They left room for discussions around feelings, relationships, and personal vulnerability.
In some cases, the guardrails around medical or psychological advice were loose enough to raise red flags. This was not a coding error, it was a policy choice. And that distinction mattered, because it suggested that Meta knew the risks and decided to move forward anyway. Why would a company with Meta's history take that chance? The answer circles back to the same pressure driving everything else: engagement. Meta's entire business was built on understanding human emotion, attention, and interaction. AI promised a new layer of that engagement, always available, always responsive, always personal. But once AI moves from tools to companions, the stakes change, especially when minors are involved. For years, Meta had struggled with issues around youth safety, mental health, and content moderation. Each controversy chipped away at public trust. Regulators grew less patient. Academics grew more critical. So when these AI policies came to light, the reaction was swift. Former insiders spoke out. Researchers warned that emotional AI without strict boundaries could cause real harm. Policy experts called the decision reckless. One former Meta AI ethics leader described it as one of the most irresponsible decisions in modern AI development. That wasn't outrage, that was professional condemnation. Inside Meta, the response was defensive. Teams argued that safeguards existed, that the technology was evolving, that competitors were exploring similar ideas, but the damage was already done. Because this wasn't just about AI behavior, it was about corporate judgment. To regulators, it signaled that Meta might once again prioritize growth over safety. To the public, it reinforced the idea that Meta had not fully learned from past mistakes. And to Zuckerberg himself, it created a new kind of pressure. For the first time in this AI race, the risk wasn't falling behind, it was being stopped. Regulatory scrutiny intensified. Policy conversations grew sharper. The margin for error shrank dramatically. This mattered because Meta's AI strategy depended on scale, on real-world interaction, on massive user feedback loops. Restrictions on how AI could engage users would strike at the heart of that strategy. And suddenly, speed became a liability. Every rushed decision now carried legal and ethical consequences. Every aggressive rollout invited oversight. This forced Meta into an uncomfortable position. Slow down and risk losing the AI race. Push forward and risk regulatory intervention. Zuckerberg's anxiety deepened. People close to the company noticed a pattern. As external pressure increased, internal direction shifted more frequently. Teams were reorganized again. Messaging adjusted. Priorities reshuffled. What looked like agility from the outside felt like instability from the inside. This is what happens when fear compounds. Technical fear, financial fear, reputational fear. Each one reinforces the others. And when all three collide, leadership behavior changes. Instead of setting a long-term path, leaders start reacting to signals. Headlines, comparisons, public perception. The company becomes hypersensitive. This was the phase Meta was entering. AI was no longer just a product race. It was a legitimacy test. Could Meta be trusted to deploy powerful AI responsibly? Could it balance innovation with restraint? Could it convince the world that it had learned from the past? These questions had no quick answers, and quick answers were exactly what Meta needed least. Yet quick answers were what its culture now demanded. That contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore, because the more Meta rushed, the more visible its blind spots became. And the more visible those blind spots became, the more pressure mounted to change course. The company was approaching another turning point, not a technical one, a psychological one. At this stage, Meta's crisis was no longer just structural, it was personal. Because behind every reorganization, every aggressive investment, every sudden pivot, there was one constant force shaping the company's behavior. Mark Zuckerberg himself was changing. Not in public statements, not in interviews, but in how decisions were made.
People who had worked with him for years noticed it first. He was more impatient, more hands-on, less willing to delegate, less tolerant of uncertainty. This wasn't arrogance, it was anxiety. Zuckerberg had always believed deeply in building for the long term. He famously ignored critics during Facebook's early years. He bet early on mobile and won. He held through scandals, regulation, and market cycles. But AI was different. For the first time in his career, he wasn't ahead of the curve. He was reacting to it, and that position was unfamiliar. In the past, Zuckerberg played offense. He shaped narratives. He dictated pace. Competitors responded to him. In AI, he was responding to others. That reversal matters more than most people realize. Founders who define eras build confidence through control of timing. When that control disappears, fear rushes in to fill the gap. And fear does strange things to leadership. It tightens grip. It narrows vision. It replaces patience with urgency. Zuckerberg's increasing control over Meta's AI operations was not a power grab. It was a coping mechanism. He did not trust the system to move fast enough without him. He did not trust the organization to make the right trade-offs. And perhaps most importantly, he did not trust himself to wait. Waiting had become synonymous with losing. This is how leaders begin to gamble, not recklessly, but insistently. Each decision is justified by the same internal logic. We can't afford to fall behind. We can't afford to hesitate. We can't afford to let others define the future. But when every choice is framed as existential, nuance disappears. Everything becomes urgent. Everything becomes critical. Everything becomes now. At Meta, this mindset spread downward. Managers stopped asking whether a project truly mattered. They asked whether it would look good in comparison to competitors. Engineers optimized for benchmarks instead of understanding. Researchers trimmed ambition to survive review cycles. The company was no longer thinking in decades, it was thinking in quarters. Ironically, this made Meta less competitive in the very race it was trying to win. Because AI progress does not reward panic, it rewards coherence. When you look at other leaders in the field, the difference is striking. OpenAI moves quickly, but its internal narrative is stable. The mission doesn't change every quarter. The trade-offs are explicit. People know why they are building what they are building. Google moves slowly, sometimes painfully so, but its integration strategy is clear. AI is infrastructure, not a gamble, not a headline, a foundation. Meta, by contrast, was oscillating. Open source, then closed. Research first, then product first. Social AI, then enterprise ambitions. World models, then code generation. Each shift made sense in isolation. Together, they created noise, and noise is deadly for large organizations. Zuckerberg was trying to compress time, to force breakthroughs through scale, money, and pressure. But AI does not bend easily to force. It matures through iteration, failure, and patience. The tragedy is that Meta still had everything it needed to succeed: talent, capital, distribution, infrastructure. What it was losing was the ability to let ideas breathe. And this brings us to the core paradox. The more Zuckerberg feared missing the future, the more his actions risked recreating the very conditions that cause companies to miss it. Over-control suppresses exploration. Urgency discourages depth. Fear erodes trust. And without trust, no amount of spending can generate genuine innovation. At this point, Meta had entered what might be called the danger zone. Not failure, not collapse, but rigidity. The company was still moving fast, but it was no longer flexible. Still powerful, but increasingly constrained by its own commitments. This is the moment when outcomes narrow. Either leadership regains the courage to slow down, delegate, and tolerate uncertainty, or the organization continues accelerating in a straight line, hoping momentum alone will carry it across the finish. History suggests that this is where most giants stumble. Not because they lacked resources, but because they lost the ability to pause. Meta was approaching that moment. And the final outcome would depend on one thing: whether Zuckerberg could accept that in AI, the most dangerous move is often the fastest one. At the end of every great corporate gamble, there is a moment of truth. Not when the money is spent, not when the headlines peak, but when momentum slows just enough for reality to catch up. Meta is approaching that moment. If you strip away the hype, the benchmarks, the press releases, what remains is a company standing at a crossroads it never expected to face. Not because it is weak, but because it is strong, wealthy, and afraid. There are only 3 realistic outcomes for Meta's AI gamble. The first outcome is the quiet one. Meta does not fail. It does not collapse. Its models improve. Its infrastructure becomes world-class. Its products ship on time. But something essential never returns: clarity. The company survives, but it no longer leads. It participates in the AI future instead of defining it. It becomes competent, reliable, and predictable, like IBM, like Intel, great companies that once shaped eras and now support them. This is the most likely outcome if Meta continues on its current path. Not because it lacks talent or money, but because organizations that optimize for safety eventually trade ambition for stability. The second outcome is the one Zuckerberg wants most. One breakthrough, one model, one product, one moment where everything clicks. If mango or avocado delivers undeniable superiority, the narrative resets overnight. Critics quiet down. Spending is reframed as foresight. Control is reinterpreted as discipline. Success forgives everything. But this outcome depends on timing, and timing is the one variable no amount of money can guarantee. AI breakthroughs are not scheduled. They arrive when conditions align. Betting everything on speed makes this outcome less likely, not more. The third outcome is the hardest, and also the healthiest. Meta slows down. Not publicly, not dramatically, but structurally. Control is loosened. Research is re-insulated. Leaders are allowed to fail quietly. Long-term projects regain protection. This path would cost Meta prestige in the short term. It would look like hesitation. It would invite criticism. But it would restore flexibility. History shows that the companies that survive technological revolutions are not the fastest ones. They are the ones that adapt when early assumptions prove wrong. This outcome requires one thing above all else: humility. And that is difficult for founders who have already won so many times. Which brings us back to Mark Zuckerberg. The $700 billion Meta has committed to AI did not buy dominance. It did not buy certainty. It did not buy victory. What it bought was time. Time to learn. Time to adjust. Time to decide who Meta wants to be in the AI era. Time, however, is only useful if you know how to use it. And that is the real question now. Can Zuckerberg relearn patience? Can he accept that AI is not a sprint? Not a platform shift you can force through capital and control, but a long, uneven, deeply human process of discovery. Because the greatest risk Meta faces is not losing to OpenAI or Google, it is losing to itself. The fear of missing the future has already reshaped the company. It has tightened control, narrowed vision, and accelerated decisions. If that fear continues to drive leadership, Meta may win benchmarks, ship products, and still miss the deeper transformation. But if that fear is acknowledged and restrained, Meta still has a chance to do something rare. Not just participate in the AI era, but help define it. So the final judgment is not simple. This is not yet a story of failure, nor is it a story of triumph. It is a story of tension, between speed and depth, between control and trust, between urgency and patience. And the outcome will depend on which side wins inside one person's mind. Because in the end, this is not just Meta's AI gamble. It is Mark Zuckerberg's.